September 20th, 1944. The mist that clung to the low French hills carried the smell of burnt oil and damp wheat. Near the village of Saint-Mihiel, known to American soldiers as Sami Hill, a German panzer commander rose from his hatch and squinted into the pale sky. He expected, as he did every morning, the shriek of American fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that had been methodically dismantling German armor across France since D-Day. Every veteran tanker knew that once the distant drone of radial engines swelled into a roar, survival became a coin toss. But what the German officer saw that morning was not the silhouette of a fighter bomber streaking in at 300 miles per hour. It was something absurd. A tiny fabric-covered biplane, gliding toward his column at barely 100 miles an hour. Through his periscope, it looked like a toy sunlight flickering off its yellow wings. Yet the toy bristled with menace, 6 tubes bazookas mounted under its wings, like the quills of a startled porcupine. To the German's mind, this couldn't be real. No sane airman would attack a panzer column in such a contraption. The aircraft, an American Piper L4 Grasshopper, was never designed to fight anything, much less tanks. It was a liaison and observation plane, a civilian trainer pressed into military service, its frame made of welded steel tubing and fabric so thin a penknife could pierce it. Its engine produced 65 horsepower, barely enough to spin the propeller of a lawnmower. In level flight, it was slower than most cars on the road. And yet that morning, the impossible was descending. Inside the cockpit sat Major Charles Carpenter, a high school history teacher from Illinois. He had once lectured about Hannibal's tactics at Cannae and Napoleon's audacity at Austerlitz. Now, in the cockpit of this fragile machine, he was about to write his own small chapter in the long chronicle of military innovation. The Piper Cub had no armor, no machine guns, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. One rifle bullet could rip through the fuselage through Carpenter's body and out the other side without slowing. It had no business in combat. But Carpenter, like so many Americans who had arrived in France that summer, was not interested in what was supposed to be possible. The war in France had entered a strange phase by September 1944. The thunder of Normandy had faded, replaced by the grinding advance toward the German border. Allied fighter bombers dominated the skies, but their very power made them slow to respond, weather fuel. Communication delays. German tanks, outnumbered but still deadly, learned to survive by hiding in forest churchyards or the narrow lanes of stone villages. To hunt them from above required not speed, but patience and nerve qualities that a small liaison pilot possessed in abundance. From 1,000 feet up, Carpenter could see the war as a living organism, the convoys like arteries, the smoke of distant battles pulsing like a heartbeat. Below, German tank crews felt trapped in their own iron cages, visibility limited to the narrow rectangles of periscopes. The L4's slow speed, mocked by fighter jocks, let Carpenter skim treetops, peek over ridges, and disappear again before anyone could fix him in their sights. On that morning, he banked the Cub into the sun. The wings flashed briefly, then he dove. German gunners hesitated. There was no wail of sirens, no armored canopy. It looked too ridiculous to be lethal. But those 6 bazookas carried the same 2.36-inch rockets that American infantry used to crack open panzers at point-blank range. Carpenter was about to prove that in war absurdity and brilliance often share the same flight path. He pressed his thumb to the trigger. A streak of white smoke erupted from his wings. The German commander below, eyes wide behind his periscope, finally understood what was happening, but it was too late. In that moment, the story of Bazooka Charlie began not as an act of military genius, but as an experiment born of frustration, curiosity, and the stubborn American belief that every problem, no matter how impossible, could be solved with enough creativity and courage. This was no fighter ace, no engineer from right field. This was a teacher who had exchanged chalk for wings. The gentleman who once graded essays about Gettysburg was now turning his flimsy classroom of canvas and tubing into a weapon. What started as a mad idea was about to tilt the balance, however briefly, in a war of steel and willpower. Above the fields of France, the quiet hum of a Piper engine announced something both terrifying and inspiring, that ingenuity, when cornered by necessity, could make even the smallest machine roar. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment with your name and where you're watching from. Have you ever heard the story of Bazooka Charlie before? Share your thoughts and let's keep the conversation going in the next part. Before he ever saw Europe. Before the thunder of artillery replaced the quiet murmur of students. Charles Carpenter stood in a classroom in Illinois, chalk dust on his sleeves and maps of ancient empires pinned to the walls. Born on August 29, 1912 in the small farming community of Edgington, Illinois, he lived an unremarkable but content life. He taught high school history, spoke gently, and believed the past held lessons about courage and folly that every young person should know. He was a husband and father, the kind of man who lingered in the hallway to help a struggling student after class. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The news spread across the country like a fever. That night, Carpenter sat at his kitchen table with his wife, weighing what countless Americans were weighing, duty versus safety. At 29, with 2 children, he could have stayed home. But Carpenter was not built for half measures. The same sense of moral responsibility that once guided his lectures on freedom now pointed him toward a war half a world away. He enlisted in early 1942, hoping to become a fighter pilot. He imagined himself in the sleek cockpit of a Mustang or Thunderbolt, dueling the Luftwaffe in the clouds over Europe. But the Army Air Forces had other plans. Older recruits, especially those with calm hands and disciplined minds, were sent to the liaison squadrons, the unglamorous but indispensable branch, tasked with observation, artillery spotting, and courier missions. It was in these ranks that Carpenter first met his machine, the Piper L4 Grasshopper, a military version of the beloved Piper J3 Cub, America's civilian training plane. The Army painted it olive drab, added an extra window for better visibility, and called it a liaison aircraft. Pilots with a mix of pride and sarcasm called them L-birds. The L4 weighed little more than 700 pounds, empty, the same as a modern Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Its Continental 0170 engine produced exactly 65 horsepower, a fraction of what powered the big fighters. Maximum speed, about 90 miles per hour, assuming no headwind. It had no armor, no guns, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single rifle bullet could set it ablaze. And yet, in an army that prized tanks and bombers, these fragile cubs became the eyes of the battlefield. L-bird pilots flew low and slow, tracing the front lines like cautious hawks. They carried radios, maps, and little else. Their mission was to guide artillery batteries by calling in adjustments. Left 100, drop 50, fire for effect. Their reward for precision was a sky full of tracer fire. German infantry used them for target practice, and gunners often joked that an L4 was so slow you could see the pilot's cigarette smoke drift backward. Carpenter arrived in Europe July 1944, joining the 4th Armored Division attached to General George S. Patton's Third Army. France was a land of dust ruins and endless movement. Patton's forces had broken out of Normandy and were charging east toward the Moselle. Carpenter's job was simple in concept, but perilous in practice. Fly ahead of the armor, locate German positions, report movements, and direct artillery fire. It wasn't combat in the traditional sense, but it required a nerve few possessed. He flew mere feet above treetops, banking over farmhouses and hedgerows, sometimes feeling the sting of rifle rounds zipping through the canvas behind his head. In those moments, every instinct screamed at him to climb higher, to flee, but to do so meant losing sight of the battlefield below. The artillery depended on him, and so he stayed. Day after day, he watched from above as American armor rolled forward and German forces fell back, yet sometimes not far enough. Through his binoculars, Carpenter often saw panzer columns slipping away, retreating into forests or villages just as American fighters were called in. By the time the big planes arrived, the tanks were gone. Carpenter knew exactly where they'd gone. He could see them, but he had no weapon, only a radio. This impotence gnawed at him. It was not in his nature to watch and do nothing. History had taught him that wars are not always won by those who follow the book, but by those who rewrite it under fire. At night in the mess tent, he'd sketch diagrams on napkins, trying to imagine a way for a light aircraft to bite back. Other pilots laughed, half joking, half in awe of his stubbornness. Somewhere between the exhaustion of constant flying and the sharp edge of frustration, a single absurd thought began to take shape. If the infantry could destroy tanks with bazookas, why couldn't he? The question hung in the air like a spark, waiting for oxygen. Carpenter didn't yet know it, but the answer would turn him from a quiet observer into one of the most improbable tank hunters in military history. The more Carpenter flew, the more a pattern gnawed at him. Every day he watched the same choreography unfold across France. German tanks would emerge to strike, then vanish into orchards or stone villages, their tracks curling beneath canopies of trees. American ground units called in for air support, but fast fighter bombers like the Thunderbolt and Mustang were often too far away, too busy, or grounded by weather. Artillery couldn't reach what it couldn't see, and Carpenter, sitting in his little liaison plane, circling above the smoke, could see everything. He saw the armor, the camouflage nets, the shimmer of sunlight off turret rings. He knew exactly where the panzers were hiding. He just couldn't touch them. That helplessness bit deep. It wasn't fear, it was the quiet fury of a man watching history repeat itself. As a teacher, Carpenter had spent years lecturing about how military doctrines failed when they ignored the unpredictable. The Maginot Line, the cavalry against tanks in 1939, stubborn adherence to rules that reality had already shredded. Now he was watching it happen again from 500 feet above the battlefield. He began to think not like a pilot, but like an engineer, or perhaps like a teacher grading a broken system. There was a missing link between sight and strike, and he meant to bridge it. His solution sounded insane, even to him at first: mount bazookas on the wings of a Piper Cub. The M1A1 bazooka, officially the 2.36-inch rocket launcher, was a weapon of infantrymen, not aviators. Two soldiers could carry it aimed from the shoulder and launch a shaped charge rocket capable of punching through 4 inches of armor if it hit squarely. It was light, portable, and plentiful, but it had never been fired from a moving aircraft. At 70 miles an hour, wind drag could alter its flight path. At low altitude, rocket exhaust could scorch the wings or set the plane alight. No manual covered such lunacy. When Carpenter presented the idea to his commanding officer, the man stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. The Piper Cub was already a fragile miracle that barely held together under normal conditions. Adding extra weight, 6 steel tubes and 6 rockets, risked pushing the aircraft beyond its limits. And even if it worked, how would he aim? There was no gun sight, no trajectory calculator, just instinct and nerves. But Carpenter argued calmly, like a man defending a thesis. The Cub's weakness, he said, was its strength. Fighter bombers were too fast to aim precisely at small moving targets. The L-4's slow speed made it a stable firing platform. Its fabric construction, while delicate, made it light enough to carry new weight. Even a few successful hits would have an enormous psychological impact. Imagine the panic German tankers being attacked by what looked like a civilian plane. It would sow confusion far beyond any physical damage. He didn't ask for official approval. He asked for a chance. His commanding officer hesitated, then nodded the kind of nod born of war's desperation. Carpenter could try his experiment, but at his own risk. That was all the permission he needed. In the evenings, he and his ground crew began the modification in secret, using scavenged parts from maintenance sheds and surplus supply depots. The mechanics' young men, who usually patched bullet holes and changed spark plugs, became co-conspirators in an act of battlefield innovation. They joked nervously, calling the plane a flying lighter. Carpenter smiled unbothered. What drove him wasn't madness or glory. It was the simple logic of frustration, the same restless American impulse that had built barnstormers and moonshiners that believed any problem could be solved with enough wire sweat and nerve. The bazookas they found were M1A1 launchers, each about 55 inches long and weighing just under 15 pounds. The rockets, M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rounds, carried shaped charges. Carpenter understood the science behind them, having once lectured his students about chemistry and explosives in war. When the nose cone struck armor, the explosive-shaped charge focused its energy into a jet of molten copper traveling at nearly 25,000 feet per second, a narrow lance of heat hot enough to pierce steel like a needle through paper. It didn't rely on brute force. It relied on physics and precision, the kind of elegance that appealed to a teacher's mind. This was not the first time a soldier had bent the rules to survive, but it was among the boldest. The U.S. Army's culture of improvisation, especially under Patton's Third Army, encouraged men to make do, to innovate at the front. Mechanics had turned jeeps into gun trucks, infantrymen had wired grenades into booby traps, and tank crews welded logs onto their hulls for improvised armor. In that chaotic summer of 1944, innovation wasn't optional, it was survival. And so, in a dusty French field, behind the front lines, as artillery thundered somewhere beyond the hills, Major Charles Carpenter and his crew turned a liaison plane into an experiment. They would test the limits of what courage and creativity could achieve when the manuals ran out of pages. History rarely announces when something extraordinary is about to happen. But in the late days of September 1944, a handful of men were about to prove that one small airplane, armed with infantry rockets and defiance, could change the way armies thought about what was possible. At the edge of an improvised airstrip near Nancy, France, Major Charles Carpenter's L-4 sat like a child's kite beside the great metal beasts of Patton's army. Mechanics had already begun stripping its wings for the boldest experiment of their lives. The air reeked of fuel and grass. Nearby, a half-destroyed barn served as both workshop and barracks. There, amid wrenches, ammunition crates, and cigarette smoke, history took a peculiar turn. Carpenter and his ground crew men, more accustomed to patching bullet holes than building weapons, worked with a blend of nervous laughter and stubborn faith. They found 6 bazooka launchers scavenged from infantry stores, their olive tubes chipped and scuffed from field use. The plan was simple enough in theory: mount 3 on each wing strut, angled slightly downward for proper trajectory. The execution was another matter entirely. Every decision was trial and error. The crew welded together crude tubular racks adjusting angles by eye. They reinforced the attachment points with scrap metal and bolts borrowed from a wrecked jeep. The bazookas had to clear the propeller arcstay balanced on both sides and fire without scorching the plane's delicate skin. It was the kind of job no engineer had signed off on, just a group of determined soldiers building something halfway between lunacy and genius. To fire the rockets, Carpenter wired a simple electrical ignition system to the control stick using an old camera trigger and salvaged wires. A red button under his thumb would send a charge to each launcher. There was no sight, no targeting reticle, just instinct and courage. When the wiring sparked for the first time, the crew cheered half in triumph, half in disbelief. They had, against all common sense, turned a liaison plane into a hunter. Carpenter studied the final product with quiet pride. The bazookas gave the aircraft a menacing new silhouette. It was still small, still fragile, but no longer harmless. To the untrained eye, it looked ridiculous. To Carpenter, it looked possible. The mechanics half-jokingly called it a porcupine with a death wish. When it came time to test it, the morning air was still and brittle. Carpenter climbed into the cockpit, the 6 bazookas glinting faintly under the thin French sun. "If this doesn't work," he quipped, "tell my students I finally practiced what I preached." The men laughed, but their eyes betrayed worry. He taxied to the end of the dirt strip, gunned the tiny engine, and the Grasshopper lifted barely. The added weight of the launchers and rockets, around 120 pounds, pushed the machine to its limits. The climb rate slowed. The wings trembled under the strain. But she flew. That alone was victory. At 500 feet, Carpenter circled back toward a knocked-out German half-track that served as a target. The moment of truth came at 300 yards. He steadied his thumb on the red button, muttered a quiet prayer, and pressed. The 6 rockets erupted with a flash and roar, leaving trails of smoke across the sky. The recoil nudged the nose upward, but didn't throw the aircraft off balance. The blast singed the paint on the wing struts, but didn't ignite the fabric. Carpenter's heart pounded as 2 rockets slammed directly into the half-track. The resulting explosion echoed through the valley, sharp, violent, undeniable. When the smoke cleared, his crew erupted in cheers. Against all logic, against all doctrine, it had worked. The world's first bazooka-armed plane had just destroyed its first target. News traveled quickly through the 4th Armored Division. Some pilots dismissed it as luck, others as madness. But soldiers on the ground were intrigued. Infantry officers weary of tank ambushes called it a farmer's miracle. Word reached headquarters. The response was unofficial approval, wrapped in disbelief. Carpenter was told he could continue the experiment at his own discretion. He named his plane Rosie the Rocketer, a nod to the famous Rosie the Riveter, who symbolized the home front's ingenuity and grit. Where Rosie built bombers, this Rosie hunted tanks. The name scrawled in white paint beneath the cockpit seemed to wink at fate itself. It was more than a label, it was a declaration. In an army of machines designed by engineers and tested in wind tunnels, Carpenter's Rosie was born in the dirt, cobbled together by hands that believed more in nerve than in schematics. That night, the little group of mechanics celebrated with rationed whiskey and the laughter of disbelief. They had done something no manual prescribed, something every academy would have called foolish. And yet, as the war rumbled eastward, there was a sense that Rosie the Rocketer might matter. Not because of her firepower, 6 bazookas couldn't stop an army, but because of what she represented: the refusal to accept helplessness. For Carpenter, it wasn't about rewriting the rules of aviation. It was about proving that courage could fill the gaps where technology failed. Rosie was fragile, loud, and underpowered, but in the hands of a history teacher, with a cause, she was about to make history herself. September sunlight fell across the fields of Lorraine, like honey, soft and golden, belying the violence below. Major Charles Carpenter's Piper L4 Rosie the Rocketer skimmed over hedgerows at barely 100 miles per hour, its fragile wings trembling as it banked eastward. Beneath him stretched a patchwork of farm roads, orchards, and the gray scars of retreating German armor. He had flown this route dozens of times, watching and reporting. But today was different. Today, the Piper carried teeth. Around 2 miles ahead, Carpenter spotted a German column snaking through a tree line, a mix of half-tracks trucks, and unmistakably several Panzer IVs. He could tell by their turret silhouettes the faint gleam of their 75mm guns, catching the morning light. Through his field glasses, he watched them lumber along the dirt road, engines coughing black smoke. They were withdrawing fast, probably, to regroup behind the Moselle. Carpenter keyed his radio. Enemy armor moving east, grid reference, Charlie 7. I've got visual. They're using the ridge for cover. The artillery officer on the other end acknowledged, but the tanks were moving too quickly for the gunners to adjust. By the time the shells were in the air, the panzers would be gone. Carpenter throttled back, circling higher. From above, he could see what the others couldn't: the fleeting opportunity. For days, he had imagined this moment, running the numbers, rehearsing in his head. 6 rockets. Maybe 20 seconds of firing window. No backup, no armor. Just him, Rosie, and 6 chances. He circled into the sun. It was an old pilot's trick, as old as combat flight itself. Attack out of the glare. Make the enemy squint. Make them hesitate. He lined up the column in his windshield, felt the small plane tremble as it descended. At 1,000 feet, the German column came into full view. The tanks looked almost peaceful from above, crawling like beetles over the earth. The panzer crews, heads poking from open hatches, never looked up. To them, the L-4 was a messenger, a harmless spotter. At 400 yards, Carpenter pressed the red firing button. The rockets leapt from Rosie's wings in a storm of smoke and flame, the recoil jolting through the lightweight frame. 6 white streaks tore through the air. For a moment there was silence, then chaos. One rocket struck a half-track square in its side armor, turning it into a fireball that sent soldiers diving into ditches. Another slammed into a panzer's engine deck, bursting into orange flame. Black smoke blossomed upward like a signal flare. Carpenter pulled up sharply, heart pounding. Behind him, Rosie's wings shuddered in the turbulence of her own explosions. He banked hard, tracing a lazy circle over the wreckage. Down below, German troops scattered. One tank crew scrambled out of their hatches, their machine gun chattering wildly. At the sky, the bullets stitching harmless holes through the empty air. He had done it. The teacher from Illinois had just destroyed armored vehicles with a civilian plane wrapped in fabric. American infantrymen, advancing nearby, saw the explosions and froze in disbelief. "Jesus," one private muttered, staring upward, "the Cubs shooting rockets now." Another soldier laughed, shaking his head. "Hell, even the spotters are getting in on the fight." Within hours, the story raced through the 4th Armored Division like wildfire. Reports reached headquarters, enemy vehicles destroyed by rocket-equipped L-4. The incredulity was almost universal. Pilots who'd once mocked Carpenter as a dreamer now gathered around him, peppering him with questions about recoil trajectory and firing range. Infantry officers began asking if more Cubs could be armed the same way. Patton's command staff, pragmatic and pressed for time, gave quiet approval. If it worked, keep doing it. That night, Carpenter sat on a crate beside Rosie, the acrid smell of rocket residue still clinging to the air. His mechanics hovered nearby, patching holes in the fabric from stray ground fire. The plane looked battered, but proud, like a farmhand after a bar fight. On her nose, the white script of Rosie the Rocketer seemed to gleam brighter than ever. Word filtered through camp, the Germans were shaken. Tank crews had begun firing at every L-4 in sight, friend or foe terrified that the next harmless spotter might rain death from above. It didn't matter that there was only one Rosie. In war, rumor can multiply a single weapon into a legend. Carpenter didn't boast. When asked what it felt like to destroy tanks from a Cub, he just smiled. Like grading an exam, he said softly, "You know the right answer when you see it." But deep down, he knew what he had done was more than a fluke. It was proof. Proof that audacity could outfly logic. Proof that even the smallest machine in the hands of the right man could turn the tide of a moment. Rosie had drawn first blood, and with it, the laughter of doubt across Patton's army finally went silent. In the weeks that followed, Rosie, the Rocketer, became a familiar and unsettling presence over the French countryside. Word spread quickly first, through the 4th Armored Division, then across the entire 3rd Army. "There's a Cub out there killing tanks." Soldiers began calling Carpenter Bazooka Charlie, a nickname that carried equal parts awe and disbelief. For Carpenter, the nickname was both a compliment and a burden. He hadn't set out to become a legend. He was simply a man who hated watching problems go unsolved. But now, everywhere he landed, soldiers wanted to shake his hand, ask him questions, or touch Rosie's patched canvas wings for luck. His success hadn't come through luck, though it had come through careful learning. Each mission refined his tactics. Each rocket fired was a lesson. Carpenter discovered that attacking from 800 to 1,000 feet provided the perfect balance between accuracy and safety. From that altitude, the rocket's trajectories stayed true long enough for him to aim, using instinct rather than instruments. He learned to begin his dives with the sun at his back to blind gunners on the ground. He found that the best range for attack was 300 to 400 yards, close enough to be deadly, far enough to evade the most desperate bursts of rifle and machine gun fire. He never fired head-on. Instead, he came in from the flanks or rear, where the German tank's top armor was weakest, often just 20 millimeters thick, compared to the 100 millimeter plates on their front. He studied his enemies the way a teacher studies his students. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and King Tiger were too dangerous, too thickly armored, too well armed. But Panzer IVs, Stooges, and half-tracks, those were vulnerable. A single well-placed rocket on the engine deck could cripple them, and the fear his attacks inspired often caused entire columns to halt or scatter. By October 1944, Carpenter's reputation reached beyond his division. Reports of a tank-hunting Cub filtered up the chain of command. Newspaper correspondents at the front began writing about him, the teacher who hunts tanks with a plane made of cloth. He was a curiosity, an anomaly in a war of steel and science. But every flight carried escalating danger. The Germans had learned. What once had been harmless observation planes were now marked for death. Machine gun nests that had ignored L-birds before now tracked them relentlessly. Low-level, flak-virling 20mm guns turned upward whenever they heard the faint drone of a Cub. Carpenter's missions grew more perilous with each sortie. Rosie came back riddled with holes so often that his crew joked she was being stitched into immortality. On one occasion, after returning from an attack near Arlon, they counted over 30 bullet holes in her fuselage and wings. Control cables were shredded. The fuel tank had been pierced, but by some miracle hadn't ignited. The ground crew patched her again with canvas tape and faith. Then came the mission that nearly ended it all. Early October 1944, during the fighting near Arnaville, on the Moselle, Carpenter took off under low clouds and light rain. The weather had grounded the big fighters, but for Rosie, this was perfect cover. Below him, German armored columns moved cautiously along a muddy road. Carpenter descended to treetop height and loosed his rockets. Two struck home, detonating against a pair of half-tracks, scattering the column into confusion. The response was immediate. Tracers slashed upward through the mist, bright red streaks cutting across the sky. One bullet tore through the cockpit frame. Another grazed his leg. Carpenter felt a searing pain, but kept control. He coaxed Rosie out of the dive, nursing the crippled aircraft over American lines, before crash landing in a field. Medics pulled him from the wreckage moments before the fuel tank caught fire. The wound ended his combat flying days. He was hospitalized, patched up, and eventually reassigned to staff duties. But by then, his legend was sealed. Official records credited him with destroying or disabling several German armored vehicles, including at least 2 Panthers, confirmed by ground troops. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross, citing extraordinary innovation, gallantry, and tactical ingenuity under fire. His mechanics received commendations for keeping the fragile Cub in the air, despite impossible odds. Later analysis revealed just how precarious his creation had been. Fully loaded with 6 launch tubes and rockets, Rosie's additional 120 pounds had reduced her climb rate by nearly half and dropped her maximum speed below 80 miles per hour. Her range shrank, her takeoff distance lengthened, but she remained controllable. Ironically, her weakness became her advantage. That slow, steady speed made for a remarkably stable firing platform. And her fabric skin, once mocked as suicidal, proved strangely resilient. Rifle bullets passed through without shattering metal or igniting sparks. Damage could be patched with canvas and glue in an hour. What made Rosie fragile also made her stubbornly hard to kill. By the winter of 1944, Bazooka Charlie Carpenter had become more than a man. He was a symbol of the war's raw creativity, the kind of improvisation that turned desperation into doctrine. For Carpenter himself, the story was simpler. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he told a correspondent before shipping home. "I just saw tanks getting away and figured somebody had to do something about it." He had, in his own words, graded the battlefield. And what his red pencil courage marked that autumn was a lesson no textbook could ever teach: that imagination, not machinery, is often the sharpest weapon in war. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the Piper L4 Grasshoppers, those fragile buzzing insects of the front, were already fading into legend. Yet one of them, patched and scarred, still bore the faint white letters along her olive fuselage: Rosie the Rocketer. Her pilot, Major Charles Carpenter, returned to the United States in 1945, a changed man. He came home not to parades or speeches, but to the quiet rhythm of Illinois life, the same rolling fields he had left behind 3 years earlier. In Edgington, his children barely recognized the wiry man who now walked with a limp and still flinched at the thunder of summer storms. But the warmth returned quickly. The teacher went back to his classroom, his voice softer, his eyes sharper. When he spoke of history now, he spoke not from books, but from memory. He never bragged. When students asked what he did in the war, he'd smile and say, "I flew low and graded hard." Only years later would they learn that their mild-mannered teacher had once hunted tanks from the cockpit of a plane made of cloth and courage. Carpenter passed away on March 22, 1966, at just 53. He was buried with military honors in the small cemetery of his hometown, a few miles from the school where he'd taught, before and after the war. His daughter Peggy kept the letters and photographs he'd sent from France, his handwritten maps, his wry notes to the crew who'd kept Rosie alive. When skeptics later questioned the story, a cub that killed tanks, those documents proved every word true. Meanwhile, Rosie the Rocketer survived. After decades in storage, she was painstakingly restored by aviation enthusiasts who recognized her significance, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Today, she rests in museums, her fabric renewed, her 6 launch tubes gleaming under the lights. Visitors are always startled by her size. She's so small, they say. And that's exactly the point. Because Rosie's legacy, and Carpenter's, was never about firepower. It was about imagination under fire. The lesson spread far beyond the war. Modern attack helicopters like the AH-1 Cobra and close air support aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II owe part of their lineage to the spirit of what Carpenter proved, that a nimble, low-flying aircraft, armed with rockets and nerve, could tip the scales against armor. The principle of adaptability, using whatever you have to do, what must be done, became doctrine refined into the sleek precision of the jet age. But in the quiet corners of military history, what lingers isn't the technology, it's the temperament. Carpenter had embodied the American tradition of bottom-up innovation, the same restless energy that had driven farmers to become pilots and mechanics into inventors. No committee planned Rosie. No laboratory designed her. She was born from frustration, courage, and the kind of thinking that starts with, why not among the soldiers who served under Patton stories of Bazooka? Charlie never quite faded. They told and retold how, when the weather grounded the big plains and the front was bogged down, a tiny cub would suddenly appear over the trees, dive through smoke, and light up the enemy's armor with rockets. Even decades later, veterans recalled that sight with a grin. You'd hear the whoosh, see the smoke trail, and think, there goes Charlie teaching the Krauts another lesson. Carpenter's story became part of the quiet folklore of the war, not the grand, metal-heavy mythology of generals and presidents, but the smaller, more human kind of legend that soldiers carry home. The kind that reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it hums on a 65-horsepower engine. Looking back, historians see Rosie the Rocketer as a metaphor for the entire American war effort, light, improvised, seemingly fragile, but propelled by an audacity that refused to quit. Carpenter didn't change the course of the war, but he changed the way men felt about it. To the exhausted infantrymen in the mud, the sight of that little plane swooping low through flak was proof that even the impossible could still be attempted. And that perhaps is the greatest victory of all. Because long after the tanks have rusted, after the maps have yellowed, and after the veterans' voices have gone quiet, the story of Bazooka Charlie endures for what it tells us about human nature. That ingenuity can grow from frustration, that courage can come from gentleness, and that sometimes in the middle of the world's most mechanized war, The boldest idea can fit inside a fabric-covered plane, flown by a schoolteacher who refused to accept helplessness. The next time someone doubts the power of a single act of imagination, remember the little cub that dived through smoke over France and the man who believed it could. You know, every time I revisit this story, I'm struck by how ordinary people can do the most extraordinary things when history leaves them no choice. Major Carpenter wasn't a born warrior. He was a teacher who refused to stay powerless. That kind of courage, that creativity under pressure, it's timeless. If stories like this one inspire you too, take a moment to subscribe, not just to the channel but to the idea that history still has lessons worth listening to. There's more to come.